The year is 582 BCE. The sun beats down on the plain of Chrysa, baking the earth until it cracks. Dust, fine as powdered bone, hangs in the air, tasting of sweat and iron. This is Delphi, the navel of the world, but the sacred silence of the mountain is a distant memory. Down here, in the stadium built to honour Apollo, the god of light and reason, something far more primal has just concluded. The crowds have thinned, their roar fading into the murmur of departing footsteps. The victors, crowned with laurel, are already being led to feasts, their names destined for poems and statues. But we are not here for the victors. We are here for what they left behind. Look closer. In the centre of the wrestling pit, the sand is dark and clotted, stained with more than just spilled wine. It is here, in the shadow of the grandstands, that the true story of the Pythian Games is written. Not in laurel leaves, but in blood. The Greece you think you know, the cradle of democracy, the birthplace of philosophy, the home of Socrates and Plato, is a carefully curated masterpiece. We are taught to admire the marble perfection of the Parthenon, to study the elegant logic of Aristotle. We imagine men in clean white togas debating the nature of the soul in sun-drenched agoras. That Greece existed, but it was built on a foundation of something else, something harder, older, and infinitely more brutal. The Greeks understood a truth we have tried to forget, that civilization is a thin veneer, and beneath it, humanity is a creature of ferocious, competitive instinct. They didn't hide from this truth, they celebrated it. They elevated it to an art form, a religious duty. They called it Agony, the contest, the struggle. And in arenas like this one, they staged rituals of controlled violence, so extreme they challenge our modern understanding of sport, of entertainment, of life itself. The laurel wreath was the symbol of victory, yes, but the price of that victory was often a beautiful death, a Carlos Thanatos. These weren't just games, they were sacrifices, trials designed to see how close a man could come to becoming a god before his mortal body shattered. We are about to walk through the ruins of that forgotten world, to uncover 11 contests that shocked even the ancients. These are the games that were too brutal to be fully remembered, the stories whispered by historians like Pausanias and Philostratus, tucked away in passages that are rarely taught in schools. The first and perhaps most infamous was a sport with a name that promised totality, Pankration. The word itself means all powers, and it was an accurate description. It was a fusion of boxing and wrestling with almost no rules. The goal was simple: force your opponent to submit. How you achieved that was left to your strength, your cunning, and your capacity for cruelty. Fighters entered the pit naked, their bodies slicked with olive oil. There were no rounds, no time limits, no weight classes. The contest ended only when one man raised his index finger to signal defeat, or when he was rendered unconscious, or when he was killed. Only 2 actions were forbidden. You could not bite your opponent, and you could not gouge out his eyes. Everything else, strangling, joint locking, bone breaking, kicking a downed opponent, was not only permitted but expected. This was the ultimate test of a man's arete, his excellence and virtue forged in the crucible of absolute violence. Imagine the scene. 2 men sculpted like the statues that would one day immortalize them, circling each other under the relentless sun. The air is thick with the smell of oil and fear. The silence of the crowd is a taut wire, vibrating with anticipation. Then the explosion of movement. It is not the elegant dance of modern wrestling. It is a chaotic storm of limbs. Fists wrapped in thin leather thongs called himantes crash against flesh. A kick to the stomach doubles a man over, gasping for air. His opponent is on him in an instant, not to pin him, but to wrap powerful legs around his neck, squeezing the life from him in a brutal chokehold. The man on the bottom, vision blurring, air turning to fire in his lungs, has a choice: submit and live with the shame of defeat, or fight on and risk never breathing again. The greatest pancratiasts were legends, their names echoing through eternity. Men like Dioxippus, who was so feared that his opponent forfeited in terror before the match even began. But the most haunting story, the one that perfectly captures the soul of this savage sport, is the tale of Aricion of Phegalia. He was a two-time champion, a titan of the arena. In 564 BCE at the Olympic Games, he was fighting for his third and final crown. The match was a grueling stalemate. Aricion and his opponent were locked in a desperate struggle on the ground. The challenger had managed to secure a powerful chokehold from behind, his legs wrapped around Aricion's torso, his forearm crushing his windpipe. At the same time, he held Aricion in a body lock, preventing any escape. The crowd could see Aricion's face turning purple, his body weakening. His coach, standing at the edge of the pit, shouted his final instructions. Not a plea for survival, but a command for glory. What a noble epitaph, he cried, to not have submitted at Olympia. In that moment, with his life slipping away, Aricion heard his master. He was dying, but he was not yet defeated. With the last ounce of his strength, he used his opponent's leverage against him. While the man squeezed the life from his neck, Aricion fell to the side, shifted his weight, and with a final agonizing effort, dislocated his opponent's ankle. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot flash that shattered the man's focus. He couldn't bear it. He threw up his index finger, signaling his submission. The referee, the Hellanodikos, stepped forward. He raised Aricion's hand in victory. The crowd erupted. Aricion had won. He was a three-time Olympic champion, but his hand was limp. His body was still. In the very moment he secured his victory, in the instant his opponent gave up, Aricion of Phegalia had died from strangulation. The judges, in a decision that speaks volumes about the values of their time, crowned his corpse with the olive wreath. They understood. He had not submitted. He had chosen death over defeat. His body was returned to his home city of Phegalia, a hero, and a statue was erected in his honour, celebrating the man who won his final victory from beyond the grave. This is the world we are entering, a world where a beautiful death was preferable to a life of mediocrity, where the line between athlete and warrior, between sport and ritual combat, did not exist. Pancration was the signature event, the embodiment of Greek ferocity, but it was far from the only trial by fire. The Greeks devised other, more specialized forms of agony, contests that tested not just strength, but the very limits of human endurance, pain and sanity. There were sports that took place in full armor, under a scorching sun, races that were designed to break the spirit as much as the body. And there was one event, an import from the militaristic state of Sparta, that was less a competition and more a public display of ritualized torture, a contest to see which young boy could endure a flogging the longest, sometimes to the point of death, at the foot of a sacred altar. The story of Aricion is not an anomaly. It is a key. It unlocks the Greek soul, revealing a people obsessed with pushing the boundaries of human experience, even if it meant shattering the human form in the process. They believed that true greatness was only revealed in moments of extreme suffering. And so they engineered those moments, built stadiums for them, and worshipped the men who survived them and the men who died trying. We have only scratched the surface. The dust of Delphi holds more secrets. The blood in the sand tells more stories. As we move on from the savage grace of Pancration, we will delve into the brutal world of ancient boxing, a sport where fighters aimed not for points, but for disfigurement and death, their fists wrapped in leather straps that could be reinforced with metal. We will explore the punishing race known as the hoplitodromos, where men ran in the full bronze armour of a soldier, a grueling ordeal that was a direct preparation for the battlefield. And we will journey to the feared city-state of Sparta, where cruelty was a virtue and pain was the ultimate teacher. The laurel wreath was beautiful, but it cast a long, dark shadow, And in that shadow, we find the true, unsettling face of ancient Greece. A face that looks surprisingly like our own if we are brave enough to see the resemblance. The call to glory, the thirst for victory, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a moment of transcendence. These are impulses that have not faded with time. The Greeks simply gave them a purer, more honest, and far more brutal form. They understood that to reach for the heavens, one must often be willing to walk through hell. And so they built their hells with stone and sand, and called them stadiums. We leave Aristiones' body, crowned in the dust, a monument to a victory won in death. But not all contests ended so cleanly. Pancration, for all its savagery, was a sport of submission. The goal was to break your opponent's will. The next ordeal we must face had a simpler, more brutal economy. It was a sport of pure annihilation, aimed not at the will, but at the face. They called it pygmachia, boxing. But to compare it to the modern sport is to compare a razor to a club. There were no padded gloves to soften the blow, no rings with ropes to trap a cornered fighter, no rounds to offer a moment's respite. There was only the pit, two men, and their hands, which they turned into weapons of devastating power. The fighters wrapped their knuckles and wrists in long leather straps known as himantes. At first, these were simple, soft leather thongs, designed as much to protect the striker's hands as to damage the opponent. But the Greek obsession with agon, with the struggle, could not leave well enough alone. Over the centuries, the himantes evolved. They became harder, thicker. Tanners soaked the leather in oil and dried it to a rock-like consistency. They were then wrapped in intricate patterns, leaving the fingers free to form a fist, but creating a series of hard ridges and knots over the knuckles. These were the himantes oxaes, the sharp thongs. They were no longer protective equipment. They were instruments of laceration. They didn't just bruise, they tore flesh from bone. The objective in pygmachia was disfigurement. The head was the only legal target. Boxers didn't dance and weave, seeking body blows to wear an opponent down. They stood, often toe to toe, trading sledgehammer blows, aimed at the nose, the eyes, the jaw. A victory by knockout was common, but a victory that left your opponent a broken, unrecognizable wreck was considered a masterpiece. The sound of a match was not the clean thuds of a modern boxing glove. It was a wet, sickening crack. The sound of cartilage shattering, of teeth splintering, of skin splitting open to expose the skull beneath. Fights were held in the open, under the searing Mediterranean sun. There was no time limit. They fought until one man was knocked unconscious, or conceded defeat often by raising a single finger, a gesture that was sometimes impossible for a man with two broken hands. Or they fought until one of them was killed. The sun itself was a weapon. Fighters would maneuver to keep it in their opponent's eyes. Exhaustion was as dangerous as any punch. As a man tired, his guard would drop, his feet would slow, and the final devastating blow would find its mark. The veterans of this sport were walking ghosts. Their faces were landscapes of old wounds. Noses were flattened into shapeless masses. Ears constantly struck, swelled with blood until they became permanently deformed masses of tissue, the cauliflower ear that was a boxer's badge of honour. Scar tissue crisscrossed their brows, and many were blinded in one or both eyes. To understand the soul of the Greek boxer, you don't need to read a text, you need to look at a statue. Not a triumphant figure of a god, but a bronze man discovered in Rome, known today as the boxer at rest. He is not standing in victory. He is sitting, slumped on a stone. His body is a paradox of power and damage. The muscles of his arms and back are immense, perfectly sculpted, the body of a demigod. But his face, his hands, these tell the real story. He turns his head to look at something we cannot see. His expression is not of pride, but of profound, bone-deep weariness. His nose is broken, bent sideways. His lips are split and swollen. His right eye is a puffy slit, the cheekbone beneath it shattered. His ears are thick knots of damaged cartilage. Droplets of bronze inlaid with copper still mark the cuts on his face and arms, representing fresh blood. His hands, resting on his knees, are a ruin. The knuckles are swollen and scarred from the relentless impact, the hermantes still wrapped around them. This is not the moment of glory. This is the moment after. The silence when the crowd's roar has faded, and all that remains is the pain, the exhaustion, and the knowledge of what it cost. He is a champion, but he is also a wreck. A man who has sacrificed his own likeness, his own face, for the sake of victory. This was the ideal. The boxer was a man who endured, who absorbed inhuman punishment and gave it back in equal measure. But sometimes, the violence of the pit could not be contained. Sometimes, the ferocity it cultivated spilled out into the world with horrific consequences. The story of Cleomedes of Astypalaia is a chilling cautionary tale. Around 492 BCE, he fought in the Olympic Games against a man named Iccos. The match was a brutal epic. Neither man would yield. Finally, in a desperate, illegal move, Cleomedes struck his opponent a fatal blow. The judges, the Hellanodicae, saw the foul. They stripped him of his victory and fined him, declaring the dead Iccos the winner. Cleomedes, enraged and disgraced, left Olympia in a black storm of fury. He returned to his home island, his mind unhinged by the public shame. He walked into the local school, where some 60 children were gathered, and there, in a fit of mad rage, he ripped out the central pillar supporting the roof. The entire building collapsed, killing every child inside. The townspeople, horrified, hunted him down. Cleomedes fled and took refuge in a massive chest inside the temple of Athena. The citizens nailed the chest shut, intending to leave him to die. But when they later pried it open, Cleomedes was gone. His body was nowhere to be found. Bewildered, they sent a messenger to the oracle at Delphi to ask what had happened. The oracle's response was cryptic and unsettling. She declared that Cleomedes was the last of the heroes, and that he should be worshipped as one. The man who had killed his opponent in the ring and slaughtered dozens of children was now to be revered. This story reveals the terrifying ambiguity of Greek heroism. The same qualities that made a man a champion in the pit, his strength, his rage, his capacity for violence, could make him a monster outside of it. The line between hero and demon was dangerously thin. The boxer, more than any other athlete, walked that line every time he stepped into the sun. But the violence was not always so personal, so intimate. The Greeks also created a contest that was a direct rehearsal for the chaos of war. It was the final foot race of the games, and it was a spectacle of organised mayhem. It was the hoplitodromos, the race of the soldiers. While the other runners competed naked, celebrating the beauty and speed of the unburdened human form, the hoplitodromos athletes came to the starting line as instruments of war. They wore the heavy bronze helmet, the kranos, which severely restricted their hearing and vision. They often wore bronze greaves, the nemides protecting their shins. And most importantly, each man carried the aspes, the large round shield of the Greek heavy infantryman, or hoplite. Made of wood and faced with bronze, the aspis could weigh over 30 pounds. The total weight of the gear was upwards of 50 pounds. Now imagine running in that, not for a few steps, but for a full sprint of about 400 metres, 2 lengths of the stadium. The race was a thunderous, terrifying thing to behold. The starting signal was not a quiet sound. It was the blast of a trumpet, the same sound that would signal a charge on the battlefield. 20 men would explode from the starting line, not as graceful runners, but as a clattering, crashing wave of bronze and muscle. The noise was deafening, the pounding of feet mixed with the clang of shields and the rasping breath of men straining inside their metal shells. The real test came at the turn. At the far end of the stadium was a single turning post, the campta. 20 heavily armed men, running at full speed, all converging on a single point. The chaos was inevitable. Men jostled for position. Shields clashed, locking together. Runners were thrown off balance, stumbling and falling to the hard-packed earth. A fall in the hoplitodromos, wasn't it just embarrassing? It was dangerous. You risked being trampled by the men behind you, their greaved shins and heavy shields, causing serious injury. It was a race that rewarded not just speed, but raw power, balance, and a kind of tactical awareness. It was a perfect simulation of the final exhausting push in a battle, the moment when soldiers, already weary from fighting, had to summon their last reserves to charge the enemy line or execute a difficult maneuver in the chaos of the phalanx. This race was not a mere novelty. It was a deadly serious part of the games because it was a deadly serious part of Greek life. Every man who competed was a citizen soldier. The stadium was just a different kind of training ground, the skills honed in the hoplitodromos, carrying weight at speed, maintaining formation under pressure, keeping your footing in a chaotic scrum were the very skills that could save your life and the life of your city in a real war. It was a public and constant reminder that the polis was always on a war footing, that its survival depended on the physical prowess of its citizens. The hoplitodromos stripped away the athletic ideal of pure naked grace and replaced it with the grim reality of civic duty. It said that the ultimate test of a man was not how fast he could run, but how effectively he could fight. The winner was not just an athlete, he was a model soldier, a living embodiment of the city's military strength. The boxer and the armoured runner represent two fundamental aspects of the Greek competitive soul. One is the cult of the individual, the lone champion who endures unimaginable pain for personal glory, his body both the weapon and the canvas on which the brutal art of his sport is painted. The other is the ideal of the collective, the citizen soldier who burdens himself with the tools of war, his struggle a public performance of military readiness. Both contests, however, took place within the structured confines of the great Pan-Hellenic Games, at Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and Isthmia. They were brutal, yes, but they were part of a shared culture. But there was another place, a city-state that took these principles of pain endurance and martial perfection and twisted them into a total system of living, creating rituals of suffering that made even the pancration look like a civilized diversion. To understand the true depths of Greece's obsession with brutality, we must now leave the relative comfort of the Olympic Stadium and travel to the stark, unforgiving plains of Laconia. We must go to Sparta, and we must witness the festival of Artemis Orthia, where the contest was not about who could inflict the most pain, but who could endure it in silence, even unto death. Sparta, the name itself is a blade. It cuts through the golden haze of classical history with a cold, hard edge. To get there, you must leave the well-trod roads that lead to the philosophical groves of Athens or the bustling ports of Corinth. You must travel south into the rugged, isolated valley of the Eurotas River, a land locked between two formidable mountain ranges, Taygetus and Parnon. The landscape itself is a lesson in austerity. It is a place of harsh sun and stony soil, a place that does not offer its bounty easily, and the city it cradled was a reflection of its environment. Sparta was not a city of marble temples and sprawling marketplaces. It was a military camp masquerading as a metropolis. There were no defensive walls, because the Spartans famously claimed their walls were the chests of their young men. There was no flourishing of art, no theatre that questioned the nature of gods and men, no architecture designed for beauty. Every aspect of Spartan life, from birth to death, was subordinate to a single, terrifying purpose: the creation of the perfect warrior, and through him, the perfect state. This obsession was codified in a system of education and indoctrination known as the Agony. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his family and plunged into a world of calculated hardship. He lived in a barracks with his age group, his life governed by older boys and state officials. He was kept perpetually hungry to encourage him to steal and develop cunning. If caught, he was flogged not for stealing, but for his incompetence in getting caught. He was taught to speak in short, pithy phrases, what we still call the laconic style. He was forced to walk barefoot in all seasons, to sleep on a bed of reeds he cut himself from the riverbank, to endure constant physical trials and brutal fights with his peers. The goal was to systematically strip away his individuality, his fear, his comfort, his very sense of self, and replace it with an unwavering loyalty to the Spartan state and an inhuman tolerance for pain. This entire system reached its terrifying apex in a yearly ritual, a religious festival that was, in truth, the ultimate final exam of the Agony. It was a competition held at the altar of a strange and ancient goddess, Artemis Orthia. This was not the elegant huntress of the Olympian pantheon. This was a pre-Dorian deity, a local goddess of the untamed wild, whose original wooden idol was said to have been stolen from Taurus by Orestes, a place where the goddess demanded human sacrifice. The Spartans, so the story went, had moderated the ritual. They would no longer sacrifice a human life to the goddess. Instead, they would honour her by drenching her altar in blood drawn by whips. They called it diamastagosis, the public flogging. But this was no mere punishment. It was a sacred contest, a spectacle of endurance that drew the entire population to her sanctuary. Imagine the scene. The altar is a simple stone block, stained dark with the blood of generations. Around it, the city gathers. Officials, priests, grizzled veterans of the phalanx, and most chillingly, the families of the boys about to be tested. The contestants are the ephebes, youths on the cusp of manhood. They are not dragged to the altar. They walk to it willingly, their faces set in masks of grim determination. One by one, a boy is selected. He is stripped naked and led to the altar. He does not kneel. He stands tall. The whips used are not simple leather straps. They are cruel implements designed to inflict maximum pain, to tear the flesh. The flagellators are strong men, often priests or officials, who lay into their work with the religious fervour. The contest begins. The first lash cracks through the cold air, a sound like a branch snapping. It leaves a bright red wheal on the boy's back. Then another, and another. They fall in a relentless rhythm, crossing over each other, raising welts that soon split open, releasing streams of blood that run down the boy's legs and pool at the foot of the altar. The goal is not to count the number of strokes. The goal is endurance. The winner of the diamastagosis is the boy who can withstand the flogging for the longest period without crying out, without fainting, without showing any sign of weakness. He is not fighting another boy. He is at war with his own nervous system, with every instinct in his body that is screaming at him to collapse, to flee, to make a sound. And the crowd watches in absolute silence. They are not horrified. They are judging. A father stands in the crowd, his face unreadable, watching his son Espak be turned into a bloody ruin. He is not looking for a sign of his son's pain, but for a sign of his weakness. The mothers, we are told by writers like Plutarch, were even more intense. A Spartan mother would stand at the edge of the circle, and if she saw her son begin to falter, she would not cry out in pity. She would shout encouragement for him to endure, to hold on, to bring honour to his family and the state. More, she might cry, stand firm. What kind of society forges a mother who sees her son's torture as a moment of potential glory? A society that has made pain the ultimate currency of virtue. The stakes were absolute. Boys frequently fainted from the blood loss and shock. But the true horror is that many of them died. They died right there at the altar, their bodies giving out before their spirit would allow them to make a sound. And these boys were not mourned as tragic victims. They were celebrated as the ultimate victors. They had achieved the highest honour a Spartan could aspire to, a beautiful death in the service of the state's ideals. They were given a hero's burial, and their names were remembered. The boy who cried out, the boy who fainted too early, his fate was arguably worse. He would live, but he would carry the stain of his failure for the rest of his life, a mark of shame in a society that valued strength above all. Else, this ritual was the furnace in which the Spartan soul was forged. It taught a boy that his body was not his own. It belonged to the state. It taught him that pain was an illusion, or at least an irrelevance in the face of duty. It taught him that the fear of shame was far more powerful than the fear of death. The man who survived this, who perhaps even won it, was a man who could stand in the front line of the phalanx, riddled with arrows, bleeding from a dozen wounds, and not break formation. He was the perfect human weapon. For centuries, this was a sacred internal affair, a pillar of the Spartan identity. But history has a way of turning the sacred into the profane. By the 2nd century CE, Greece was under Roman rule. The Romans, with their insatiable appetite for spectacle and their fascination with the exotic barbarism of the peoples they had conquered, discovered the diamastagosis. The ritual was transformed. What was once a solemn test of civic virtue became a depraved tourist attraction. The Romans, connoisseurs of blood sport, were enthralled. They travelled to Sparta specifically to witness the floggings. To accommodate the crowds, they even built a Roman-style amphitheatre around the altar of Artemis Orthia, with stone seating for the paying spectators. The ritual became more theatrical, more brutal. The priests now held the idol of Artemis Orthia during the ceremony, and they claimed that it grew heavier in their hands if the whip-bearers did not strike the boys hard enough, demanding more blood. The contest was no longer just about endurance. It was about satisfying the bloodlust of a foreign audience. Young Spartan boys, heirs to a once proud warrior tradition, were now performing their agony for the entertainment of their conquerors. They still died at the altar, but now their deaths were not just a sacrifice to their goddess and their state. They were the climax of a thrilling show. The brutal logic of the Agony had eaten itself. The system designed to create men who could never be conquered had devolved into a gruesome performance for the pleasure of those who had conquered them. The story of the diamastagosis is a journey into the dark heart of idealism. It shows what can happen when a society becomes so devoted to a single virtue, in this case, martial endurance, that it is willing to sacrifice its own children on its altar. The Spartans created the most disciplined and feared soldiers of the ancient world, but the price was the suppression of almost everything else we consider human: art, love, compassion, freedom. The flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia was not a game in the way we understand it. It was the ultimate expression of a worldview where the individual was nothing and the state was everything, and where the only way to prove your worth was to silently endure being destroyed. This brutal logic, however, was not confined to Sparta. Across the Greek world, other contests emerged that tested the limits of the human body and spirit, often with lethal consequences. And some of them involved an opponent that was not human at all. We must now turn our attention to the island of Crete, a place of ancient myths and bull-haunted palaces. Here, in the shadow of the Minotaur's labyrinth, the Greeks practiced a sport so daring, so acrobatic, and so insanely dangerous, it seems to belong more to legend than to history. A contest where men and women faced a charging bull, not with a spear or a sword, but with their bare hands and a prayer. We leave the blood-soaked altar of Artemis Orthia, a monument to a society that had perfected the art of turning boys into weapons. But the Greek world was not a monolith. It was a fractured mosaic of cultures, each with its own unique relationship to violence, to divinity, and to the eternal contest of Agony. To find our next game, we must leave the mainland's grim obsessions behind. We must take to the sea, letting the salt-scoured air wash the scent of Spartan blood from our minds. Our destination is an island that floats in the Greek imagination like a half-remembered dream. Crete, the birthplace of Zeus, the kingdom of the legendary King Minos, and the home of a civilization so ancient it predated the Parthenon by 1,000 years. The Minoans. They were not like the dour Spartans or the argumentative Athenians. Their art speaks of a different sensibility. It is alive with vibrant colour, with flowing lines, with images of dolphins leaping from turquoise waves, and women with elaborate hairstyles and bared breasts. They seem a people in love with the beauty and energy of the natural world. But do not be fooled by the lilies and the dancing girls. For at the heart of this vibrant culture lay a ritual so dangerous, so breathtakingly audacious, that it makes the brutal pragmatism of a Spartan flogging seem almost mundane. It was a contest that pitted the most fragile of creatures against the most powerful. Man against bull. This was not bullfighting, the grim, earthbound ballet of the Spanish corrida, where the matador-esque goal is the systematic weakening and killing of the animal. This was something else entirely, something that defied gravity, that flirted with death not through dominance, but through a terrifying, acrobatic grace. They called it taurokathapsia, bull leaping. Our only true windows into this lost art are the frescoes and seals the Minoans left behind, frozen moments of impossible courage. The most famous from the Palace of Knossos is a masterpiece of kinetic energy. It shows a massive bull, its body a taut curve of muscle, charging across the frame. The animal is in mid-gallop, its power absolute, its horns a pair of polished daggers aimed at the heart of the world. But it is not alone. The fresco depicts 3 human figures, their bodies slender, athletic, almost impossibly elegant. Their skin colour differentiates them. 2 are painted white, a convention for female figures, while the central one is reddish-brown, a male. One figure, a woman, stands at the front, her arms outstretched, her hands gripping the bull's horns. In the centre, the male figure is captured in mid-air, upside down, performing a perfect handstand on the bull's back as he vaults over it. Behind the bull, a second woman stands with her arms raised, ready to catch the leper as he lands. It is a single, fluid motion, broken into 3 parts: the approach, the vault, the landing, a dance with death. Let us try to reconstruct it. The arena was not a sandy pit or a grassy field. It was most likely the paved central court of the great Minoan palaces at Knossos or Phaistos. An audience of nobles and priests would watch from the surrounding balconies. Into this space, a wild bull captured from the rugged Cretan hills is released. Imagine the sound. Not the roar of a stadium crowd, but the sharp, echoing clatter of hooves on stone. The furious snorting of the bull, its breath pluming in the air. Then the lepers emerge. They are young, in the prime of their lives. They are not heavily muscled like the pancratiasts. They are lean, agile, built for speed and explosive power. They wear nothing but a loincloth and perhaps elaborate jewellery. They are oiled, their skin gleaming in the sun. The bull paws the ground, its eyes wild with rage and confusion. It picks a target and charges. The earth-shaking thunder of its approach. Most men would run, but the bull leaper runs towards it. This is the first moment of impossible courage. You must meet the instrument of your potential death head-on. Just before the moment of impact, as the bull lowers its head to gore, the leper must time his jump perfectly. He grabs the upward curving horns. This is not an act of strength, but of timing and nerve. He cannot stop the bull. He must join it, borrowing its cataclysmic forward momentum. The bull, in its effort to toss him, actually provides the force for the vault. The leper is thrown upwards. He must tuck his body, push off the horns, and perform a somersault over the animal's massive galloping body, landing on his feet on the other side, where his partners wait to steady him. The margin for error was non-existent. A fraction of a second too early, and you are trampled. A fraction of a second too late, and a horn finds your chest or your stomach. If your grip slips, if you lose your nerve, if you mistime the vault, death is not just a possibility, it is a certainty. You would be gored, thrown into the air like a rag doll, or crushed under the weight of a half-ton of furious muscle. And yet, they did it, men and women, together. This is perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the sport. In mainland Greece, the games were an exclusively male domain, a celebration of warrior masculinity. But here in Crete, the frescoes show us women in the heart of the action, as essential to the team as the male vaulter. Were they equals, priestesses, or were they, like the Athenian youths and maidens of the Minotaur myth, a form of ritual tribute chosen for their beauty and athleticism to face the sacred beast? We don't have the texts to tell us. The Minoan script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. The story is told only in these silent, vibrant images, and this silence deepens the mystery. Was it a sport, or was it a prayer on the edge of a blade? The bull was a potent religious symbol for the Minoans, representing fertility, power, and the untamable forces of nature. Perhaps by vaulting over it, these young acrobats were not defeating it, but honouring it, momentarily uniting human grace with divine power. It may have been a rite of passage, a trial that transformed adolescents into adults. Or perhaps it was a more civilized reenactment of an older, darker ritual, human sacrifice. The legend of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull monster who lived in the labyrinth and devoured young Athenians, may be a distorted memory of this very practice. The bull leaping could have been the ordeal the chosen tributes had to face. Success meant survival and honour. Failure meant being consumed by the bull god. Whatever its purpose, the brutality of bull leaping was of a different order than what we have seen before. It was not the grinding, attritional violence of boxing or the disciplined self-destruction of the Spartan ordeal. It was the explosive, instantaneous violence of a catastrophic failure. It was the brutality of the fall, the gore, the splintering of bone against horn. It was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle where the price of a single misstep was absolute. It elevated risk itself into an art form. But this unique, death-defying dance was a relic of an older world. As Minoan civilization faded and the power centers shifted back to the mainland, a different kind of high-stakes spectacle took center stage at the Great Pan-Hellenic Games. It was a sport that combined the power of animals with the ambition of men, a sport of aristocrats and kings that was fueled by wealth, prestige, and an appalling disregard for human and animal life. It was the thunder of the hippodrome, the most prestigious, the most expensive, and by far the deadliest event of the Olympic Games, the chariot race. The Minoan bull leaper, whether priest or sacrifice, exists for us only in silent, painted moments, a fleeting union of human grace and brutal divine power. But as we return to the mainland and to the zenith of the Olympic Games, we find a spectacle where the gods were less a partner and more a malevolent spectator. This was a sport that harnessed the power of beasts not for a sacred dance, but for a thundering, high-speed race to oblivion. It was the premier event, the one that overshadowed all others in prestige, expense, and sheer catastrophic carnage. We have arrived at the hippodrome, the chariot race. Forget the heroic sanitized versions you've seen in cinema. The reality was a cauldron of chaos, a display of aristocratic ambition so profound that it used human and animal life as disposable currency for glory. Look past the gilded chariots and the magnificent, purebred horses. Look at the men holding the reins, and look at the track itself, a vast open killing field, haunted by a malevolent spirit the Greeks called the Taraxippos, the horse frightener. The hippodrome at Olympia was not a neat, clean oval. It was a massive, oblong track of packed earth, nearly 2/3 of a mile around. At one end stood the Heisplex, an ingenious V-shaped starting gate with individual stalls for up to 40 chariots. At the other end, 2 stone pillars, the Nyssa, marked the terrifyingly tight turning posts. The race was 12 laps. 12 times the chariots would have to navigate those turns. This was the stage. The players were twofold, the owners and the drivers. The owner was almost always a wealthy aristocrat, a tyrant, or even a king. It was they who financed the teams, who bred or bought the expensive horses, who hired the drivers, and it was they, and they alone, who received the olive wreath of victory if their team won. The owner didn't even have to be present. The charioteer, the man who actually risked his life in the race, was a nobody. He was often a slave or a hired professional, an expendable human component in a rich man's machine of glory. His only prize was survival. His reward for winning was that his master was honoured. Imagine the moment before the start. 40 teams. In the most common event, the Tethrapon, this meant 40 chariots, each a flimsy construction of wood and wicker, and 160 horses. Half wild, bred for speed, their blood running hot with adrenaline. The air is electric, thick with the smell of horse sweat, dust and fear. The drivers stand in their chariots, the leather reins wrapped tightly around their bodies, a practice that gave them more control, but also meant that if they were thrown, they would be dragged. Tucked into their belts is one essential tool, a knife to cut themselves free if everything went wrong. The trumpet sounds. A mechanism lowers the ropes on the starting gates, one by one, to ensure a fair start. Then the final rope drops. The gates are open. The earth shakes. It is not a race, it is a cavalry charge, a stampede, an explosion of sound and violence, as 40 teams, 160 horses, and 40 men funnel towards the first turn. This is where the carnage begins. The goal is to get to the inside lane, to hug the turning post as tightly as possible. But there is not room for 40. Chariots slam into each other. Wheels lock, axles snap. A horse stumbles and the team behind it ploughs into it at full speed, creating a pile-up of splintering wood, screaming horses with broken legs, and men trampled under the hooves of their own teams. And then there was the Taraxipos. At one of the crucial turns of the hippodrome, there was a spot, an altar perhaps, that was believed to be haunted by a spirit that terrified horses. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, tells us that as horses approached this spot, they would suddenly be seized with a frantic, inexplicable terror. Their eyes would roll back, they would rear up, ignoring the driver's commands, and crash into the chariots around them or into the post itself. Whether it was a ghost, a feature of the landscape that cast a strange shadow, or simply a piece of psychological warfare, a story told to drivers that became a self-fulfilling prophecy, the effect was real. The turn of the Taraxipos was the epicenter of the destruction. This was the brutality of the chariot race. It was the chaos of a multi-car pile-up at 50 miles an hour, with no safety features, no roll cages, only flimsy wicker and flesh and bone. The driver who was thrown was almost certainly doomed. He would be dragged by his own reins, his body battered against the hard track, tangled in the wreckage, and crushed by the teams thundering behind him. The historian Pindar tells of one race at the Pythian Games, where 41 chariots started. By the end, only one was left standing. The entire field had been wiped out in a series of horrific crashes. The victor was a man named Arcesilaus of Cyrene. He won not necessarily because he was the fastest, but because he was the only survivor. This sport was the ultimate display of wealth and power. The Athenian general and playboy Alcibiades, seeking to awe the Greek world with his prestige, once entered an unprecedented 7 chariot teams in a single Olympic Games, finishing first, second, and fourth. The glory was his, but the cost was paid in the blood of the anonymous men who drove for him and the horses that were destroyed. The chariot race was a spectacle of aristocratic indifference, a game where the rich played with the lives of the poor and the powerful gambled with fortunes, all for a crown of leaves and a moment of immortal fame. From the wrestler who died for his crown to the boy whipped at the altar, from the boxer who sacrificed his face to the leper who danced with the bull, to the charioteer dragged to his death, we have walked through a gallery of beautiful and terrible contests. These were not mere pastimes. They were the central rituals of a culture that did not fear the darkness within itself. They did not hide their love of violence or their obsession with glory. They built stadiums for it, wrote poems about it, and called it holy. And what are we to make of this now? It is easy to look back with a sense of superiority, to see these games as the barbaric relics of a distant, unenlightened age. We have our rules, our safety equipment, our ethics committees. We have separated sport from ritual sacrifice. Or have we? The Greek notion of Agony, the struggle, has not disappeared. It has merely changed its clothes. We still crave the spectacle of bodies pushed to their absolute limit. We still elevate our champions to the status of gods and shower them with a wealth that would make Alcibiades blush. We still gather in our own modern colosseums, or by the millions in the digital arena of the screen, to watch contests of speed, strength, and controlled violence. The form has changed, but the fundamental human impulse remains. The desire to witness a struggle, to pick a side, to live vicariously through the triumphs and failures of others on the field of contest. The Greeks were simply more honest about the stakes. They knew that the pursuit of greatness often demanded a terrible price, and they were willing to pay it, or watch it be paid in the full light of the sun. Their brutality was not a flaw in their civilization. It was an essential part of it. It was a philosophy of existence carved not in marble, but in the scar tissue of its champions. They believed that without the risk of real loss, there could be no true victory. Without the shadow of death, there could be no immortal glory. Perhaps the most shocking thing about these ancient games is not their violence, but their honesty. They serve as a dark mirror, reminding us that the line between civilization and savagery, between the athlete and the sacrifice, is far thinner than we like to believe. The ghost of the Tarex hippos still haunts our own turns. The roar of the crowd in the hippodrome still echoes in our stadiums. The games never ended. The stadium just got bigger.